Has he been Christian? When did you get there? Philosophy team? Yeah, and where we were going. Okay.
Oh, that, there was one building.
Where are you?
Okay. Couldn't get Lenore up this morning. I couldn't get her up this morning. Sorry, for years they took it away. So how are you doing, Charlie? You're still living in Fairmont and Richmond?
The location is and really nice people.
It's a nice place. It looks nice from the outside.
Yeah, I really do. You like what you have.
Yeah, it's good. The nice thing about it is, you know, we meet other people that live there. And you can have dinner in the dining room, like last night. Last night, we had a Shabbat dinner. Except, there must have been 14 people maybe.
Jensen Park.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of Dutch people. Pardon? Oh, yeah. They're advertising that you know. Oh, yeah, we must have about, I would say we have 25, 30 people. All right. Out of a total patient population, resident population of close to 200. You know, and you probably know you know Margie Stacks.
No.
Her husband used to own oh yeah. Well, welcome back. You're looking good. Who are you, sir?
I'm her son.
Oh, what's your name?
Mia.
This is my son, Dan.
Oh, good, Sid.
Oh, okay.
Good morning.
Long Jesus, long Jesus.
Yes.
I live in Massachusetts.
Hey, question. Mama.
Yep.
Where?
I did see Fred months ago. Skating clubs. But thanks for the reminder. Can you try and reach me?
No, I haven't.
So you're from Massachusetts. Where in Massachusetts?
We live in
I
the
will
West.
make a note to give them a buzz. And
It's a nice apartment.
Oh, it's beautiful.
no, it's about 400 pages. It's things, yeah. Essentially what she did was she
Closest one is
there
in the suburb of Chicago.
two big men.
Ruth.
And I thought it was unfair.
She used to be in San but
Each of
they moved about 2 years ago.
so you know that something was said about his death and so on. And since they were
Same commuter train.
she ended the book essentially.
Yeah, his son and his wife live in Chicago.
So I thought, and she that's a significant part of who she was. And by the way that the author organized the book, she couldn't really go there. It is. Yeah. I'm now listening to Elise Farring. FER. Listen to her third sentence. FERRNC.
Yeah,
You know what you think.
okay.
I haven't, somebody gave it to me on CD. If you can't find it, you'll find it on YouTube, but if you can't, I'll get mine. It's quite something.
Okay. There are a lot of composers are neglected now. Some of them are worth being.
There's a piece in the Times this morning about Leon Bernstein
Yeah,
conducting a program at Carnegie Hall on deservedly forgotten. I mean, he's the guy who's singing up a lot of people. So the author of that piece admires Bernstein, but didn't think that his pieces deserve a place.
I remember Emerson Baptor wrote a review of the, of the Busoni Concerto, piano men's chorus orchestra. He ripped it to shreds, and he said that his memory would be better served by a memorial to him. And he also had nasty things to say about Rachmaninoff, which I disagree with.
I do too. His third concerto is, I think, one of the greatest.
Yeah, and the second concerto is
Nothing wrong with melody.
no.
I mean, Verdi made the comment at one point about the Italian genius for opera as opposed to the German, which is a little unfair. Get his point. It's all about melody.
Yeah.
What you do with it. Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Good morning. Just like home. Nobody pays any attention. Good morning. Hi. Shabbat Shalom to everybody. So nice to see all of you on this gorgeous day. And welcome to those who are live streaming. I did bring my phone, just in case I remember to look at it. During the couple of years when I was here by myself and didn't have a robust group, of course my phone was always on my mind because that was my communication with others. Now that we're here, I get absorbed with what we're doing together and don't look. But I do hear from people from time to time after our session. What did I want to say? Something or other. Okay. Oh, welcome to Irv and Enid back. So good to see you. And others are back as well, and we seem to be growing a little bit. So I'm so glad that we are growing a little. Blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. I always succumb to the temptation at this moment in our morning to say something like, we're about to finish one topic. And next week we'll move on to the next one. And I was tempted to say that this morning, but I decided not to. We never know. But we are still working on For What Can I Hope? And we're doing it through David Hartman's really very interesting article with the title Sinai and Exodus, Grounds for Hope. Soon enough, we will turn to our final topic, What Can I Know? The most terrifying to me of Kant's questions. Because if we accept the distinction between knowledge and belief, then knowledge is a very high standard. I mean, we believe several things, but do we ground them in such a way that we can claim that we know them? Knowing means if I know something, I can't be wrong. If something is the case and I know it, it is the case. I can believe it and it's wrong, but knowledge is a much firmer thing. And I don't know that the Bible, being a non-philosophical text, ever worries about that question. I mean, it certainly is very interested in conviction, but conviction is a species of belief. So that's one of the reasons I'm a bit afraid of the question. But we'll contextualize it and come up with a lot of great things. So we have been working on two modes of hope, which Hartman thematizes around two episodes in the Bible, both of them in the book of Exodus. One is the Exodus event, the liberation from Egypt, and the other is the Sinai event, the giving of commandments. The one focuses on our weakness, our inability to solve our own problems, like the servitude in Egypt. And we looked at the passages from the early chapters of Exodus and noticed that people tried, but they were unsuccessful. And so God stepped in. Okay? So the Exodus paradigm, and by paradigm I mean we have a story which is about more than the features of that particular story. Or we could do it in temporal terms. The Exodus story is about a certain slice of time, if you take it as referring to history. A paradigm is not about any particular slice of time, but about all time from a particular perspective. And that's Hartman's point, that the Exodus story is about liberation in general, and about the question of what are the resources for the possibility of liberation. So the Exodus paradigm is about our neediness, about our weakness, about our inadequacy. The Sinai paradigm is about the opposite, our strengths, our capacities, our, in some sense, ability to craft our own future, to craft our own life. So you can see that these two paradigms give us two different ways of, maybe I should say complementary ways, of seeing into our first question. What does it mean to be human? And what it means to be human is to be able and weak, capable of crafting our own life, and needy, and needing some help from others or other sources. So in a certain way, we're back to the question of anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And that's what we're working on here. What are the two grounds for hope? And, I often ask myself questions like, who are the greatest poets? Who are the greatest philosophers? Who are the greatest composers? It's a foolish enterprise in a certain way. But I like to think about that in order to think about just what makes certain composers, philosophers, poets stand out. In a way, it's a conversation with myself, recognizing that one can never arrive at who are the top three composers, who are the top three poets of all time, there are many different candidates for this, and so it's in a way foolish to do it. But I ask myself another question in this regard. What are the greatest books of the Bible? What are the most important books? What is the most important book in the Bible? An unanswerable question, but still a fascinating one because it pushes us to think about the contents of particular books and to ask ourselves what makes them great, if not the greatest. Candidates for that question are certainly the book of Psalms, the book of Isaiah, the book of Deuteronomy. There are several candidates. I think that our study of the issue of hope through the lens of Hartman's essay suggests that the book of Exodus may be the most important. It lays down the fundamental paradigms and the fundamental narrative. And one of the ways of thinking about that is that most everything, if not everything, flows from that story. What we can do, what we fail to do, though we can do it, and what are the resources in the event that we do fail. We try again, or perhaps there is a God who comes to our aid, and so on. So I want to go back to Hartman, and we want to read some other things along the way. So Hartman here is finishing his discussion of the first paradigm, and that is the Exodus paradigm. And unsurprisingly, he turns to the Passover Seder, in which the liberation from Egypt is celebrated. And he says that the Passover Seder, which records the story of the Exodus and begins with the phrase, "We were slaves in Egypt," the participants are instructed, in every generation, each person must feel as though he himself or herself came out of Egypt. So this already illustrates this point, doesn't it? It begins with slavery, not only as a reality, but as a problem. And the Seder follows, in some important ways, the narrative of liberation. But when he says here, points to the passage, in every generation, each person must feel as though he or she came out of Egypt, Now he has moved from the story to the paradigm. That each of us is to think that we are involved in this story and that we have experienced some form of liberation in our own lives, the capacity for liberation. And therefore the Exodus story is not only what we might call of antiquarian interest. Antiquarian means in the past. And one of the reasons for reading history, studying history, is to learn about the past. But if the past is prologue, then the study of history is not only about what happened in the past, which is interesting, but how what happened in the past is relevant to our challenges today. The past as paradigm, the past as the possibility of drawing lessons, although we don't want to do it in a simplistic way. So I think already here, Hartman has opened us to the nature of the Passover Seder as a reflection of the Exodus paradigm. The linking, he says, of past salvation with future redemption is made explicit in the blessing recited before the drinking of the second cup of wine. The two motifs are joined together, tying the past, and now he quotes, who redeemed us, immediately to the future, brings us to other festivals. Happy in the building of your city, where we shall eat of the sacrifices and paschal offerings, and we shall give thanks to you with a new song. So the Passover Seder is structured, I might say, polyphonically. Thank you. That means poly, more than one. Robert Schumann's symphony, I think people say, is monothematic. He has one theme and he works it in different ways. Polythematic is several themes going on at the same time. And I think that Hartman is suggesting that the Passover Seder is polythematic. It's about the past, it's about what happened to our ancestors as foundation, but it's also about our lives in an ongoing way, past and present at the same time. Whenever the Passover was celebrated, he says, it brought hope. And therefore, the memory of the Exodus became a crucial element in Jewish communal experience. By this, I think he means down through the ages, Jewish communal experience. As the tradition vividly evoked the memory of the miraculous deliverance from Egypt, it inspired and created the certainty of a future redemption. And, you know, I often ask the question, we've discussed it over the years, how did the Jewish people keep the idea of Israel, the land of Israel, alive during millennia of exile? How did they do it? I mean, it's an enormous achievement. My grandmother came to the United States in 1890. What is that, 130 years ago? I have no desire to go back to Hungary. Hungary is not a part of my thought process or aspiration. I think that's probably the predominant understanding of immigrants. I may be wrong about this, but we tend to adapt to new circumstances and try to look to the future. We may feel grounded in the past, but we don't necessarily want to re-invoke, especially in spatial terms, what the past was. Spatial terms, a particular land. And yet the Jewish people has been able for 2,000 years to entertain the hope, the real hope of returning to the land. And as soon as circumstances made it possible, they did it. from a variety of perspectives. And I think that's what Hartman is suggesting here. As the tradition vividly evoked the memory of the miraculous redemption, deliverance from Egypt, it inspired and created the certainty of a future redemption. Now, when you think about the Exodus paradigm, that suggests a certain way of seeing the aspiration to return to Israel, a deliverance. So you recall that some of the ideas in the late 19th century about the return to Israel were based on the imperatives for human beings to take action, to create their own return to Israel. Human-centered. Why is it that traditional Jews resisted, even considered heretical, the idea that human beings on our own can pick ourselves up and go to the land of Israel? The Orthodox would have no problem if Jews decided to move from Berlin to Warsaw. But to Israel is now a part of the major arc of Jewish history. And the Orthodox resistance to human initiative is that millennially we always thought that God would take us back to the land of Israel. And not until God decided that we were going back. So that you could see that even Zionist thinking, maybe that's the wrong word, because Zionism suggests something that results from human initiative. So let me say, return to Israel thinking can mimic, can imitate both the Exodus and the Sinai paradigms. How do we do it? Answer one, we wait for God. And the Talmud over and over again says that we should never storm the gates of Jerusalem. This is, God has a plan, and the plan is something like, I'll return the people to the land of Israel when their punishment has reached its culmination. And only God knows that. And therefore, for us to take up arms or to get on boats and go there on our own suggests that we know when our time of exile is up. And that's heretical. So that the traditionalist view is based on an Exodus paradigm. The modern Zionist view is, I might say, we haven't gotten there yet, but we know what we're talking about already, based on a Sinai paradigm, that human beings have capacity and responsibility, and therefore can seek to resolve their own dilemmas. So you can see how these two paradigms can help us to understand different periods of history, not just Jewish history, with one of them or another weighted, W-E-I-G-H-T, heavier or lighter. As the tradition vividly evoked the memory of the miraculous deliverance from Egypt, it inspired and created the certainty of a future redemption. That's the Exodus paradigm of hope, right? Certainty. In other words, empirical conditions need not define the possible as long as the Exodus memory is alive. I might say, what are the empirical conditions? Well, there's complexity, there are different views, I'm capable of achieving my goals in some way and maybe not another, and therefore I have no certainty that my efforts are going to be able to arrive at the culmination of my aspirations. But if you've got an Exodus paradigm, then you can have certainty. Now, you don't know when. In other words, empirical conditions, the way things are now, need not define the possible as long as the Exodus memory is alive. The possible, I don't know if it's what I want to do is possible, but in the Exodus paradigm of hope, that possibility is always alive because God created the universe and split the Red Sea and made the sun stand still. And his promise that he will bring us back to the land of Israel is a certitude. That's the Exodus. That's the power of the Exodus paradigm, isn't it? Even though what is problematic is the question of when. The Zionists who were asked to wait. Martin Luther King. You remember that famous letter from Birmingham jail? The clergy, he wrote the letter to 8 clergy people in Birmingham, one of whom was a rabbi. And they had said to him, wait, go slow. And he wrote back and said, no, it's time. That is, I'm not waiting for some deliverance in the future. We're going to help ourselves now. I take it that that letter, in a certain way, was a resistance to the Exodus paradigm and an assertion of the Sinai paradigm. And it's time. The Seder begins with the story of the Exodus from Egypt and concludes with next year in Jerusalem. So now he's going to move to Sinai, the other paradigm. Sinai suggests quite another theological model. That's so interesting. I might have thought he would write, Sinai suggests quite another model, now not based upon God, but based upon another foundation, let's say human beings. But in other words, the difference between the Sinai model and the Exodus model is not the difference between God's action and not God's action. I might think that the Sinai model of human adequacy would not need God to be involved. So his use of the adjective theological is already a hint at what he's going to talk about a little bit later. And that is, these are both covenantal models in a certain way. They both require, from his point of view, some involvement of God. I think that's going to be a challenge. Sinai suggests quite another theological model upon which human beings can nurture a sense of hope. And now he's going to quote Exodus chapter 24. None of this should be surprising. In other words, at Exodus 19, we arrive at Mount Sinai. So when we arrive at Mount Sinai, we're arriving at the second paradigm. So to quote Exodus 24 is going to be an illustration of the Sinai paradigm. And Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. Now, if I'm writing this passage, the next thing I say is, and the people did the following. And what could they have done? They could have done at least 2 things. The celebration of the gift. Thank you so much. Or they could have done what the book of Exodus does here. And Moses took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do and obey. Their response was not passive celebration. Thanks for giving us the Torah. We're going to put it in the ark and we're going to read it from time to time. But a turn to human responsibility. From the model of the Exodus, that turn is not inevitable. But now it's a turn to human capacity. One of the interesting ways of dealing with books of the creative mind, poems, symphonies, novels, is at certain moments in the unfolding of this work, what might the composer have done? which highlights what the composer actually did. I'm going to give you one example, just very quickly. If you don't know Schubert's Last Piano Sonata, go discover it. It's unbelievable, really. Powerful. In the second movement of this sonata, Schubert at the beginning makes a certain move, a certain modulation. When he comes to the return of the first part, and he approaches that modulation, and that's what we expect, he does something astonishing. I always just sit up, erect in my chair, and say, wow. In other words, what Schubert might have done is to repeat what he did before, which is beautiful enough. What he did was surprised us. So the question, what might the composer have done? What might the poet have done? Helps to illuminate the genius behind what the poet did do. And I think that's a nice principle of reading in general, to find those moments which really distinguish a creative genius. And in a way, we have it here. All that the Lord has spoken, we're going to celebrate. That's what the author might have done. We will do and we will obey. This is a radical turn to human capacity. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord made with you concerning these words. You remember in Exodus, in Genesis 15, that when God promises Abraham certain things, Abraham is put to sleep and he has this dream of bloodied animals going between two fires. Blood here suggests, and we mean it. This is serious. So when Moses sprinkles the blood on them, which to us is problematic, what it means is, you guys just said we're going to do this. We're going to perform the Torah. I hope you didn't mean this in an offhand way, a nice thing to say, because now God is going to hold you responsible. Now you are responsible. The giving, back to Hartman, an acceptance of the Torah does not present a picture of God's single-handed redemption of powerless slaves, nor of unilateral divine fiat ordering primal chaos. What is Hartman doing here? He's bringing back another element of the Exodus paradigm. That's the creation of the world. God redeemed let's put it this way. God redeemed the world from chaos. By creating an orderly world, God offered some redemption. This was God's work only. So, the giving and acceptance of the Torah doesn't present a picture of God's single-handed redemption of powerless slaves, nor of unilateral divine fiat ordering primal chaos. So we have two big paradigms, really there are more, of God's initiative, redeeming the people from Egypt and the creation of the world. And if you buy that connection, then the redeeming of the people from Egypt is another creation. And in a certain way, it follows the model of creation. The creation now of a people out of the chaos of slavery. So the creation of the world is not just a one-time event. It also serves as a paradigm for the possibility of more creations of order out of chaos now through history. The prophet Isaiah uses the creation paradigm as well for a new creation of the people coming out of the Babylonian exile. I mean, I think it illustrates the power of these models. The power of the models to help to explain future dilemmas and events. That's the power of a paradigm, that it continues to have application. Rather, Hartman says, the experience of Sinai is one in which God speaks and human beings respond. The law reveals divine confidence in human beings in spite of the short-sightedness and weakness Israel showed in the desert. That's so interesting. The Sinai model, among others, it's not just laws that we should follow, but there is a kind of anthropology involved, doctrine of who we are. Divine confidence in human beings. That is, the confidence that we have the capacity to help to build a better society, just to put it in that way. This is an optimistic view of human beings, isn't it? Whereas the Exodus paradigm isn't automatically a pessimistic view, but it certainly makes harder to understand how human beings can solve their own problems. In a way, the Exodus paradigm has a pessimistic sense that unless there's an intervention, my problems are not going to be solved. Whereas the Sinai paradigm suggests I don't need an intervention. I can do it myself with what I'm given. The law reveals divine confidence in man in spite of the short-sightedness and weakness Israel showed in the desert. When you think about it, we've talked about this before. The book of Numbers in the desert involves one rebellion after another, doesn't it? Miriam and Aaron against Moses, the people against Moses, Korach against Moses, but finally Moses and Aaron against God. Remember, they strike the rock and neither of them go into the land of Israel. So the book of Numbers, from a human point of view, ought to lead to despair. What Hartman is saying here is that in spite of human weakness, vacillation, and so on, there is enough confidence in human beings that the story is allowed to go on by a God who is patient with human beings. The Torah symbolized the Torah, not the book itself, but what it says, symbolized divine acceptance of finite mortals. It signifies God's move from creator-redeemer, creation, the Exodus, to teacher, to instructor, who is prepared to educate, to guide, and to impart of himself. The giving of the law at Sinai expressed a belief that human beings have the capacity to implement right behavior in his life. Another ground, this is the point, another ground for hope. Hope in ourselves. Who has hope in ourselves? We could take a little survey right here. How many, I'm not intending you to respond to this. How many feel that we can solve our own problems? Yeah. Few of us, maybe all of us. How many feel that we really can't solve our problems in any huge way? Maybe a bunch of us. The Torah is suggesting, according to Hartman, that there is optimism about human beings' capacity to solve our problems. But there is, of course, a vacillation in the Torah because we're made of both. That's the idea, isn't it? In other words, we could isolate each paradigm and ask, what does it mean? Or we can put them together in a kind of conversation and recognize that it characterizes the oscillation of the human condition from capacity to incapacity. The giving of the law at Sinai expressed a belief that human beings have the capacity to implement right behavior in our lives. He didn't say here to solve our problems, because you remember at the beginning of this essay, Hartman recognizes that the Sinai paradigm requires that we understand complexity, that we're able to live with partial solutions, that we recognize that we solve one problem and create another. In other words, the Sinai paradigm is grounded on a sense of humility about our capacity to really bring the eschaton, to bring the end of days, but that we can still make some progress. A sense of hope emerges from the memory of the command to become holy. Despite human limitations, weaknesses, perversities, and ugliness, human beings are charged with responsibility, and we are even called by God to become part of a holy people. Not just individuals, but to create a holy community. In contrast to a certain Greek notion of self-sufficiency, the revelation at Sinai proclaims that perfection is to be realized in relationships. Notice that he's now made a transition from individual to community to the primacy of relationship. The covenant biblical God chose interaction with human beings. So, relationship number one, God chose to call us into a relationship with God and to assume mutual responsibility for making a better life. So, by the way, on the question of what can I know, what's the status of this notion that God called us into relationship? Is this a fact about the world, or is it a conviction of the biblical author, fact or not, to which we are called? Now, a view of Torah that suggests or that implies that God wrote the Torah, this would move it toward knowledge. This is what God's self, said. If it's a human creation, then it's harder to get to knowledge, facts themselves. Was the Torah given on Mount Sinai? Let me do a better one. Was the Red Sea split? If you have a divine origin of every word and letter of the Torah, the answer has to be yes. God doesn't lie. God's telling you the way it is. If this is a human-created document, then the answer is, I don't know. I'm called to believe it, if I feel called to believe it, but the belief doesn't lead to knowledge, because did Raskolnikov ever live? Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment hero? No. Except in the way in which the answer is a resounding yes. Yeah. Raskolnikov as paradigm. It raises that question which we're going to try to deal with. The biblical God chose interaction with human beings. The Lord of history, as opposed to an impersonal ground of being, pronounces that interdependency is an ultimate datum of reality. Hartman has just said what I said in a more elegant way. That this sentence is based upon a belief that God gave the Torah, and if whatever God said is true. Period. Listen to what he says here, and you'll see that. And I take it that we disagree with that by and large. The covenant biblical God chose interaction with people, the Lord of history, as opposed to an impersonal ground of being. You know, that's that idea that there is some essential being out there. It's impersonal, and to come to discover it helps us to know what it means to be human. God is not an impersonal ground of being in the Torah, but a personal God who's involved in history and relationship. That's the point he's making here. The covenant biblical God shows interaction. The Lord of history, as opposed to an impersonal ground of being, pronounces. The ground of being doesn't make any pronouncements. Just sits there. Pronounces that interdependency is an ultimate datum of reality. On the knowledge question, is what the Bible says true, has everything to do with who one thinks wrote it. Isn't that true? Isn't that true? History and community, therefore, are central to a tradition where perfection is grounded in relationship. That's the covenant idea, that we're in some kind of partnership with God. And since community is so important to biblical religion, we're also bound in relationship to one another through that relationship with God. Isn't that the structure of Jewish life in a way? That something is given, and that we form our community, our relationship to one another, through what is given, which is deeply relational in import. Malcolm?
I don't feel like I'm getting any closer to the answer to either of these two questions of Kant's. For what can I know, or what might I hope? So I'm thinking about it in your contrasting perspectives of who is the author of the Torah. And if I choose God, then, as you say, that makes this true knowledge. And if I say it's man, it is relative. But even if I choose the first,
Yeah.
I can't know that. As a human being,
Yeah.
I don't know. So it seems to me I'm stuck with the second of knowledge being relative with either choice.
Yeah. Look, there's a difference between what you can choose to acknowledge and what the phenomenon itself implies or wants to imply. One of the functions of God as author of the Torah, and one strong view of this, is that God didn't just give the Torah. God wrote the Torah. Every word and letter has a source in the divine mind. That is a way of saying, this is me saying it now, that it's true. What God wrote is true. That's the function of saying God wrote it. So that this is not a matter of belief or disbelief. You can resist, you can say, I don't believe that God wrote it, or you can say that God wrote it and I don't think it's true. But I think the function of God doing this is that it's true. Now, look, one can deny that God wrote it. One can deny, therefore, I'm saying therefore, that what's in it is objectively true and therefore knowable, and move to belief. I don't know it, but I believe it. And if you move to belief, then you're asking the question, what are the elements of the narrative of the Bible which compel assent? I am not going to say it's the very truth, but I am willing to say it's my story. This is the story in which I live my life. So, one can either say, since X is true, that God wrote it, Y and Z and A and B and C are true. Or I can say, if X is not true, and God did not write it, nevertheless, I can feel its power in my life, and therefore, I can live my life as if it's true. In other words, a question for us early 21st century people where we're skeptical about the very truth itself, have to ask ourselves, in what way can we make firm commitments in our life and live by them? And some of it has to do with an as-if quality. There's a famous book by a Kantian philosopher. His name is Hans Weinger. Anybody hear of Hans Weinger? Their philosophy of als ob, as if. And he writes this whole book about what does it mean to jump onto a circle without, I might say, without legitimation. I'm just doing it. I'm jumping onto a circle of belief, not so much because of its grounding, but because of its products. The product is it helps me to live a rich, ever-evolving life for myself and for my family and for my community. In other words, one tests, the status of the Bible can be understood in terms of the three verb tenses, past, present, and future. I can say I take the Bible seriously because of from where it came. It came from God, let's say. And that itself makes me take the Bible seriously. Or it came from geniuses. And since they're geniuses, I'm going to take the Bible seriously. Or I can say, I don't care from where it came. I'm going to look at it itself now. And the content, if I read it, I can see that it contains huge wisdom. And therefore, I'm going to accept its premises for my own life. Or I can ask, not from where it came, nor what it is, but what did it lead to? And think of the Tanakh, what it led to. It led to this very moment. 4,000 years later. We're still here. My goodness gracious.
And we're still studying the book.
And we're still studying the book, and we're still living in our own way Jewish lives. It also created the New Testament. It had something essential to do with Christianity. This is not I'm not saying that the Christian message is true. All I'm talking about is the phenomenon that it emerged from our book. And they made it their book. I'm not making a judgment at all about validity or invalidity. In a certain way, the Quran, although we just don't know what the basic pretexts are for the Quran tells the Joseph story, but in a very different way. So this means either that they've played fast and loose with the story they got from our Bible, or there was a different Joseph story circulating at that time. But certainly the fundamental stories, some of them. So if one asks oneself just what are its products, what did it lead to? That in itself is a strong argument for trying to take it seriously. It's not a QED, but even let's say the Euclidean geometry, even the human enterprise that we think of as true. Immanuel Kant thought that the Euclidean geometric views of space and time were true. That space is a receptacle for objects, and that space is not an entity that can be affected by objects. You put the fruit in the bowl, it doesn't affect the bowl. Let me try that out. Well, we learned from Einstein, from black hole theory, that certain intense forms of gravity bend space, affect time. So what Kant thought to be the very eternal truth about space and time turn out to be part of a hypothesis, but a powerful hypothesis. In other words, even the things we think are claims to knowledge, like arithmetic or geometry, are based upon assumptions, premises. They have an as-if quality too. Vivian, do you have a...
Well, I'm sitting here, I think you've touched upon inspiration.
Inspiration.
Yes. And I'm back to the Bible as story. And I'm trying to remember if this was your quote. We're taking a lit course, and it may have come from a course on existentialism, but in trying to square uncertainty, we talk about poet. I'm going to bring it back to poetry. When you read a poem, you see the words there, but look at all the ways you can read it.
Yeah.
The words, the transaction again is the reader and the writer. The writer disappears on that page.
Mm-hmm.
It is what it is. And so I thought this was really powerful. It said poetry is comprehensible enough.
Right.
And is that not where we are in reading as we puzzle
Yeah.
what's real, what's the story, what's inspired?
I would say
Where's God? I mean, it's all there.
I would say yes and no to that question.
Okay.
Is it comprehensible?
Cool. Help.
I'm hedging my bets. I can't help but think of a baseball image.
Great.
So, some batters hold the bat like this. You remember Stan Musial? Stan Musial, who had this kind of crouch where he was going to... So, let's ask the question, what are valid batter stances? And the answer is not one and only one way of doing it. But the answer is also not every way. If I'm standing there and I have the bat down here on the ground, nobody's going to recommend that stance. Because though the range of baseball batter stances is comprehensible enough, that doesn't mean there's only one way of comprehending it. There are ways of understanding a poem that are not going to carry weight, like this batting stance. But in the universe of plausible readings, there's more than one way. And that's Torah too. I mean, I think you're right about this, that even though there's a subjective element in reading something, not every interpretation is valid. I mean, people often say, well, that's just your interpretation. Sure, there are others, but not every interpretation gets to the subject matter. And I think that's true about Torah, isn't it? There are many ways of living a life. Think of the three denominations of Judaism. Each denomination focuses on a different arena of Tanakh. The Orthodox world focuses on law, Exodus, Deuteronomy. The Reform world invokes the prophets, at least in our classical period, ethics. The conservative movement, interestingly, focus on history. The career of the Jewish people. That's why the conservative movement embraced Zionism long before either the Orthodox or the Reform did. The Reform didn't because we're universalists. What does that mean? Go back to one small corner of the world. Be a light to the nations. That's why we had trouble as a movement accepting Zionism. The Orthodox believed in law and law's author, God. And the tradition tells us that God will tell us when we go back to Israel. But if your focus is on the story of the people, then you look at the trajectory of that story in the fundamental document, and you can see it's Israel-oriented. And therefore, Zionism is a part of the story of the people, and we can embrace it. So there are 3 plausible readings of the Torah here based upon a different center of gravity. Mordecai Kaplan's Reconstructionist Judaism comes out of the conservative movement. Kaplan said there are 3 pillars of Jewish life: belonging, believing, and experiencing. It's not believing, belonging, experiencing. It's belonging, believing. What's primary is peoplehood, and not articles of faith or other ways of exploiting a religion. So I think that's a good example of, we can read a poem that way. What's the center of gravity? What is it? What's the key to really understanding that poem? It can be a variety of things, but it can't be everything. I'm not saying you're saying it, but why am I saying this? Because it's not just a subjective matter. If you take the text seriously, then you have to pay attention to the limits of interpretation that the text insists on. Patty?
I see the 2 questions that kind of propose the what can we know and what can we hope for kind of intertwined based on Malcolm's question. Because reading the Torah, no matter what interpretation you apply to it, there's certain things that we've learned over time, either through the study of psychology or anthropology, that we learn are true. People flourish in relationships. That's what the Torah says. There's a truth to that, regardless of who wrote it. There's a truth to the fact that if you have hope, you're more likely to survive certain circumstances that are beyond your immediate resources to solve yourself. So as far as what can we hope for, we can hope for whatever is going to get us through. And what I was thinking about, most of the people in this room, we can solve our problems. We're pretty good at that. We know who to call, we have resources, but if we were Ukrainians or Syrians, those problems are so much bigger than any one of us can manage on our own, that I feel like if you can hope for someone to rescue you, or some allies to show up, a peace deal broker, whatever those things that you can hope for, then hope that that's what you use to get through it.
Yeah.
And maybe the Torah can teach us that through the Sinai and Exodus stories, but I'm not really convinced by Hartman's premise. I feel like
You're not really what?
convinced by his premise that those are like paradigmatic. I thought about the Holocaust, and if you're waiting for God to save you during the Holocaust based on he got us out of slavery in Egypt, that's hard to hang on to, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. No, I think, well, first of all, Patty, I think that I'm a little surprised to hear you say that what Hartman is doing isn't compelling to you, because you've just rehearsed it in a powerful way. That there are 2 kinds of hope, and that the issue of hope is, in a sense, a pragmatic one. What helps us to get through? And each of those 2 ways are ways. We do rely upon our own resources and one another, but we also recognize at certain times, like the Syrians, the Ukrainians, we rely on something outside of ourselves. And so the twin paradigms help to account for the 2 different kinds of experience that human beings have. And if hope is a pragmatic idea, then to have both is to enlarge the possibility of hopefulness. That's what you've said. But you've also said that, and I think you're right about this, there are extreme circumstances, and maybe not so extreme, I have to think about it, where neither paradigm seems to work. like the Holocaust. You hope for God to come and help you, and God didn't come. And you hope for human beings to help you, and human beings didn't come. I mean, Roosevelt could have come if he had wanted to. It may not have solved the problem, but there were things human beings could do, and for one reason or another didn't do. So,
I guess my difference is what can you hope for, God? That doesn't really, I can't hang all of my hope on that.
right. So, and I keep thinking about those who are asking me over the weeks, repeat the question, repeat the comment, and so where are we here? We have two powerful paradigms, powerful in one way or another, and we have now you've brought into play the notion of the limitations of those paradigms, and then you've said, and the God part of this is something you can't really accept. So, and I would never, what's the verb here? I would never try to talk you out of it. Because I think that the belief in God, don't quote me on this. Is a hypothesis. I mean, is there a sublime, sovereign spirit at the heart of the universe who cares about us? All the appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, in whom we can place some hope and with whom we can have a relationship to brighten our lives and undergird the possibility of optimism. Huh? Oh, if belief in God brings that, I'm gonna try. But there's no certainty about it. Last night in my little comment at the beginning of the service, where I quoted the Torah portion for this week at the end of Leviticus chapter 22, where it says, God says, I will be sanctified among the people, which is a strange thing to say, that God is going to be sanctified by us. And one of the points that I tried to make was that God is not coming out of the clouds to announce his, her, their reality so that it becomes crystal clear. It's a hypothesis. I'm going to live as if something like that exists, and I'm responsible for making that reality palpable in the lives of community. If I follow the commandments, in a way I'm saying, I believe in a God and a spirit and a power and a reality that makes me feel that I must follow these ways. And by doing it, I bring the idea of holiness into the world. If I'm an honest person, I am boosting the value of honesty. See, this is a guy we like and admire, and he's really honest. Honesty must be a value. If the good person represents a value, that not only says something about the person, but about the value. There are two guys trying out for shortstop. One guy fields 20 grounders in practice, and the other guy fields 400 grounders. Who am I going to cast my lot with, at least at the beginning? The guy who values grounders and feels that it has something to do with being a good shortstop. I want to be a shortstop too. Who am I going to emulate? The guy who values, I'm not sure this analogy works all the way down, but so this notion that we sanctify, we bring holiness, the idea of value into the world through our behavior. I think is stronger if you accept the hypothesis that these are commandments and not just subjective preferences. And therefore, the dare that there is a God, I think, has power to it. But it's only a dare. Because we don't have any first-hand evidence, do we? Yes, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good.
Sorry, I'm late. Well, I could listen to you talk for eternity because you're the smartest person. But I keep hearing the same words used, and sometimes I struggle with it because maybe we use it.
Speak a little louder, please.
I keep hearing the same word. And I don't know if we're using it. It's true. Anyways, it's true, truth, truthful, and truthfulness.
What is truth? Is that your question?
Yes.
How do I know?
I just say you're the smartest man I know. Come on.
I think of it, if I could say so, asymptotically. That is, there is a certain formula, I can't remember, xy equals 1, xy equals 1. Yeah, the higher x is, the smaller y has to be. So as the line moves along the x-axis, it gets closer and closer. In other words, x times y equals 1. That means 1,000,000 over 1,000,000th. If I go on this line 1,000,000 units, then it gets on this line, the y-axis, closer and closer to 0. 1,000,000th is much closer to 0 than 1/10. Does it ever get to infinity? Because the only way it really fully reaches the x-axis is if y is 0. And y can't be 0 because we can't get to infinity. That's what I mean by asymptotically. I think we can move toward an understanding of what truth might be, but I don't think we can ever answer the question, what is it? But we can make progress. John Keats is closer to the truth than, I don't know who. No, don't you think? Don't you think? Some poets have gotten closer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And some would say the truth is facts, but I think also truth is a transcendent, fundamental, or spiritual reality
Okay.
instead of just facts.
Okay. Good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean,
relating to the math thing, which math is fact.
you can't convince anybody that that's true. That you.
There you go.
No, there you go. I mean,
There go I.
yeah, I mean, it's all conjectural, but it's not totally up for grabs. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think we can get to the very truth of things. Patty's disinclination to take God into this picture, for all I know, is the very truth. But I would argue with it on personal grounds, not to try to convince Patty, because there are some ways of understanding the world that are more powerful than other ways. To whom? To the ones for whom they're more powerful. Not for everybody. But are there no insights? Are there no deep ways of living a life than other ways? I spend my time, I get up in the morning and I have a bowl of cereal and I turn on the TV. And I watch it until lunch. And then I watch it again until dinner time. Then I watch it again until I go to bed. Would anybody say that that is a life well lived?
Yes.
Exactly. In other words, the answer is yes, But I think the consensus of people would move toward no, but that wouldn't make them right. If I have 100 people who said no, that's no better than 10 people. If I had 1,000, if I had 1,000,000 people, these are choices. But I think there are grounds for better or less better choices. Okay. All right. So I do want to go on just a little bit here. Where are we? See what I mean about I'm always inclined to say at the beginning, we're going to finish this topic today.
We know better, yes.
Yeah, you know better. I do too, but I keep saying it. So let's see here. Let's see here. So he says, history and community, therefore, are central to a tradition where perfection is grounded in relationship. That's a powerful way of living a life, isn't it? Hope in relationship. Is it the only way? Is it the best way? Is it the true way? How do I know? I mean, we're just trying our best, and by exposing different resources for a good choice. What are our resources? I'd rather spend a time reading T.S. Eliot than watching TV, though I like to watch TV. That's a choice that I make. Hope, he said, need not be fueled by romantic dreams. It can be nurtured by feelings of adequacy to bear the responsibility of becoming a spiritual person, and by the knowledge that in spite of failures, I am given a task. I can live my life that way. And I will fail, and I won't be able to accomplish everything I set out for myself, nor can we together. But I recognize that I'm given a task, or I accept that I'm given a task. The very giving of commandment, that is, the understanding of myself as commissioned. That is a good question, a good idea, isn't it? How do I think of myself? And does everything I do, is it the product of calling myself? Roger, I want you to read this poem today. Okay, I'll read it. Different from, I'm called to read this poem. I've told my story, I'm going to just say it very briefly about, people used to ask me, they still ask me, when were you called? And my answer has always been, are you kidding me? I mean, I decided to go to rabbinical school. What do you mean called? But I came to feel that I am called. Not in the literal sense that God opened the clouds and said, this is what I want you to do, but that this is who I was meant to be. I feel commissioned, but not in any literal sense, but I feel that the task is who I was meant to work on in its many different manifestations. This notion of being commissioned is an interesting way of seeing oneself as an alternative. This is what I was meant to do.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Maybe you figure out that you weren't called as such at the beginning, but since a lot of us are looking at the earlier parts of our lives and say, now I see I was called. I may not have seen that then, but I see it now.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. And I not only do I like the way you've put it, but I like the universalizing that you did. I certainly wouldn't want to make the claim that only those who get to be clergy are called. I think we're all called in one way or another, in one form or another, to do what we do. I mean, I think this is a blessed life in a way, to feel that I was called to do what I'm doing. Wow. Spinoza has this notion of amor fati, to love your destiny, to fall in love with who you were meant to be. Now, that doesn't need to be our work. It can be our relationships or our tasks. if I go down to a homeless shelter and work once a week, once every other week, and feel I'm meant to do this, that gives it a power, doesn't it? Harry?
Aren't we being a little elitist?
What about the homeless? What about
Very
the
good.
homeless person?
Very good.
Go down to other parts of the city. Do you think the garbage collector was called to be a garbage collector, or the waiter in the restaurant was called to be a waiter in the restaurant? You know, you kind of drift into things. And I think all of us, to a certain extent, drift into our profession, whatever. We may afterwards try to rationalize it by saying, that's our calling. But I don't think we got into it that way. And a lot of people outside our circle certainly don't get called, quote, called, unquote, to do what they've done with their lives.
Oh, so Harry, God, that's a great comment. I think you've said a couple of things, one of which I think I agree with and one of which I don't. One can be called, so I wake up one morning and I feel I'm called to go to rabbinical school, so I'm going. That's the call preceding the activity. And you're doubting whether that is the case very much. The other is the reverse. I'm doing it, and I've come to feel that I was meant to do it. The latter is me. I mean, I went to rabbinical school. I've had some reasons, but after 10 years in the rabbinate, I left. But fortunately, it came back. So that was an emergent thing for me. But we do have an intuition in a way about, even before we can really make it concrete, about, and I'm not talking just about vocation, I'm talking about choices in life, for example. And I'm wondering too, maybe this is just another version of elitism. I mean, a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant can say to him or herself, there are two ways of doing this. By the clock, and I'm just going to bide my time until I'm ready to go home, or I'm going to do something of significance here. I'm going to think of myself as helping people enjoy a meal, enjoying one another, of expressing courtesy to another person, of being able to resist when I might have wanted to talk back, just so that I'm going to live a high-quality life in this particular way I'm living my life. Don't you think everybody can say this? I mean, it may be elitist to say the garbage man can do that too. You know, I'm helping to make my community cleaner. There's a difference between being and being articulate about it. I mean, a garbage person may feel very much that without articulating it, that he feels good about the work that he's doing. Then another level is, and I'm feeling good about this. One is doing it. So I think it's all possible, but yeah. Irv.
I think it's pushing it a little bit to make that insight universal. Why don't we just say there are the fortunates among us are called, but not everybody is called ultimately.
Yeah. And I'm trying to use the word called with a small c, not a big C. And everybody can feel the value of what they're doing, and therefore, but I get your point. One doesn't want to universalize too many things. But I think there's still power in the thought that we have a choice. We may not have a choice about what we do, but we have a choice about how we do it. Don't you think? I want to be sure there are other voices. Joan?
Does a calling have to be a profession? You seem to be talking about it totally as a profession.
Exactly.
A garbage man can have, like, he has a calling to be a good man, a good father, his abilities limited, and this is the way he has to go about it.
It's a good point, actually. I mean, we've been focusing, at least I've shaped it in terms of the work we do. And it may be that a certain individual doesn't feel called to do the work he or she does, but feels called in other aspects of their life. I don't like my work, but I can still be a good friend, a good father, a good husband, or a good wife, and so on. I think it's a good point. What we're talking about is meaning, isn't it? A life of meaning. The Jim.
If there's no one else, I'll.
Jim, I'll get to you.
No.
I think it takes some pride too, because we've all seen people that are so downtrodden. Doesn't matter if it's their own fault or not. I was very surprised as I came across various friends and business associates that have retired. I was amazed how many of them hated what they did for 40 years.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate. I like what I do, so I still do it. And I think the reason I like it is I feel productive.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is I was very, very surprised to find people had done things for 40, 50 years, detested every day, but they felt compelled they had to do it. I think it probably did something to them physically, mentally.
Yeah.
But you get locked in a situation and people are dependent on you, it's pretty hard to walk away.
Well, I think this is part of Harry's point about the elitism of this discussion, because sometimes we find ourselves into something that doesn't give us gratification, either vocation or in other parts of our life. It's not as if we all have choices everywhere.
Well, but it gets back to the beginning of today's discussion, when you said we read the Passover story every year as if we were there, yet it was assigned of 40 years to make sure the people that were there didn't get there.
Yeah. It's very true. I mean, and it's the point about hope that may never come to pass.
But I think it's more pointing, but it's more pointing out the frailty and the limits that we all have.
No question. And that moves, I think, to the Exodus paradigm. Whether it's God, something else, or nothing, sometimes we fail. And I think the Torah specializes in the dynamics of failure. But it still hopes.
Yeah.
That's the amazing thing about it, I think. Vivian.
Well, I would like to get back to Hartman for a minute.
Good.
Because I have a question that's been hanging out here for like 3 weeks.
Okay, good.
And I'm curious now, and I've been waiting for it to resolve
All
somewhere
right.
here, but it has yet to. Why has the essay and the whole construct or the paradigm not bridged the two with some discussion of leadership? Because leadership seems to be what holds the Exodus story together.
Whose leadership?
Moses.
Just Moses?
Well, Aaron.
Just Moses and Aaron?
Well, no.
How about God?
Oh, well, but
I mean, just not to slip God into the discussion.
Slip him in, but I'm trying to slip Moses into the discussion. That's all. We talked about covenant. We've talked about. It's all this cocktail, but Moses is in the middle. He is the agent. He is what pulls the transient people, and what keeps them under, safeguards them, shepherds them, throws them into the. So I understand we're not looking for the leader, but he is the model of leadership, which brings you back to commission.
Yeah.
He was commissioned. He is the model for the people as coalescing as community.
Right.
And that's what moves us as community forward, are people who step out and lead.
Yeah. So it's a nice addition to our conversation.
here's why it's not an expendable. What you're saying is not expendable. So if we're going to give a full picture of what we're talking about, we'd have to talk about leadership. The reason it hasn't emerged, and I doubt if it would have, is I have no problem bringing him in. I'm not trying to apologize on behalf of Hartman for not bringing it in. We're talking about two ways of being human. This is about human beings and what it is we hope for. Do we hope for the maximization of our own capacities? Do we have confidence in that? Have we seen results from that? If we think of hope, do we basically think of the Sinai paradigm, which is about all human beings? Or do we basically think about the Exodus paradigm? I need help, the people in Syria or the Ukraine. So I think the reason leadership hasn't emerged and may not is not because it's unimportant, but because we're talking about human beings and our attitudes.
But leaders can be inspired by God. I mean, you want to go to Ukraine, look at Zelensky. I mean, I don't know that how he's inspired and lifted us all. I mean, in the most terrible of circumstances.
I'm afraid, in a way, the introduction of God into this discussion has been misleading.
I didn't mean to mix Zelensky.
No, it's good because, God, if we think of the Exodus paradigm, God is, let me put it this way, again, don't quote me, filling a slot. God is, if we look at the universe of the Exodus paradigm, we would have X would stand for the people, inadequate, and Y would stand for something outside human capacity that we can still count on to help us. Y could be Superman. That Superman plays that role, doesn't he? Y can be arms from the United States Congress. It doesn't need to be God. So God is just filling a slot in this anthropology. How do I feel? Do I feel adequate or inadequate? If I'm feeling inadequate, but I still have hope, that's the question. How can I still have hope? Then I might move to hope from outside, which doesn't need to be God. So I think individuals, whether it's Moses or God, aren't essential to what I'm going to call the structure of these two paradigms. One has X only, human beings, and we can do it. The Exodus paradigm has two variables, an inadequate X and something else. If there isn't a something else, then I'm hopeless. And Patty's idea here that God didn't come into the Holocaust is X without Y. Whereas the Exodus paradigm in the Bible is X with a Y. The Y just happens to be God in this story. The Y could be Superman. It could be James Madison. It could be Alexander the Great. Couldn't it? Could? I'm sorry?
Doctor Who.
I didn't hear you.
Doctor Who.
Doctor Who. Okay, well, Horton Hears a Who. Is that a Horton Hears a Who?
What time is it?
Yeah. So in a way, I think the question of leadership, though important, confuses the situation a little bit. Moses is in both paradigms, by the way, isn't he? I mean, he says to God on several occasions, "Get me out of here. I cannot handle this." Jeremiah says to God, "Choose somebody else." And God says to him, by the way, I chose you when you were still in the womb. You can't get out of this, though he wants to. That's the Exodus paradigm. I can't handle this myself. And God says to him, I see that. I see that. I can't get rid of your Exodus psychology, but I'm going to try to get you to be Sinai and to tell the people what they need to do, because it matters. That's an interesting point, isn't it? One of the themes of biblical prophecy is reluctance. Don't you remember Isaiah says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I can't do this. Then the angels touch his lips. Now he can do it. So Moses, when he's called by God, tries to get out of it in 4 different ways. Who am I? I'm not adequate. Who are you? The people aren't going to believe that you called me. Who are the people? These are all rhetorical questions. Who am I? I'm inadequate. Who are you? I'm unknown. Who are the people? They won't listen to me. You're setting me up. I stutter. So Moses, who's the first prophet, is the paradigm of prophecy. Willing reluctantly to embrace the task, but always wishing to get out of it. That's both paradigms, isn't it? That's good. So leadership, now I can see how it might be an important part of the discussion. Very good, very good. All right, next week. Let me, since we're having a good time here, let me ask you this question. I don't care what I'm going to ask for a vote. Let me tell you what the alternatives are. Next week, we continue with the issue of hope, or we move on to the next topic. Okay, so, how many would like, I'm sorry?
We should know what the next topic is.
The next topic is, what can I know? What can I know?
Oh, yes.
What does the Torah tell me about what I can hang my hat on?
Good.
Yeah. Okay. So, how many, even though you're not 100% about this, would nevertheless like to go on with hope? Okay, very good. Oh, very good, very good. All right, hope it is. No. How many would like to move on to the next topic?
Which is?
Okay.
Can we hope for?
How many hope that we're going to go on to the next topic? Okay, very good. All right, the next topic it is.
Good.
Yeah.
But within that topic, there has to be hope.
Well, I think that's right. That's part of the story. That's part of the story. All right. Lively, wonderful session. Always so much fun. Shabbat shalom.
Good to be back, Roger.
Nice to have you guys back.
Next week, I'm going to start out, if I ever get a chance to talk, by saying what we were talking about is semantics. What do you really mean when you say truth? And I'm always troubled by the fact that, for me, truth and facts are synonyms, but for many people they're not.
You know who Ludwig Wittgenstein was?
Yeah, I know of it.
The Wittgenstein's, the only book he published was the Tractatus. He begins the Tractatus with the following statement. The world is everything that is.
That is the case?
That's what you just said. What is the case are the facts. What isn't the case so much are emotions, religion.
Emotions are facts.
They're facts, but they don't tell us about the facts. They just tell us about the facts of the
Well, we're going to get it.
No, that's right. It's all
We're in a murky area.
Look, the question is geometry true? I would say if you embrace the intuitively plausible axioms, it's true, not only in the sense that it's an elegant, logical, coherent structure, but it led to so many things. Okay, But that's
That's the test of empiricism.
well, yeah, it's a built-in
We're getting too deep for this time of Saturday morning.
But it's not just semantics.
Well, depends upon what you mean by semantics. But okay, it's not, I looked up Wittgenstein.
Yes?
I look up everybody. I Google everything I encounter. If I'm not mistaken, he was in another one of these Jewish guys who came from a very, very rich family. Yeah, and all of these big names in philosophy and even in science and so on. The Budapest mafia people, they're all
Niels
kids.
Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, these guys.
Von Neumann.
Von Neumann, sure. Oh, that's, yeah, good.
I didn't always agree with it.
Your word commission. Yeah, it's the commissioner, right.
She said, we're passing, we really have
It's
no
understanding that.
constitutional
Right.
reason to do it. We have no authority to do this, but we did it.
They did it.
Yes.
And again.
Rabbi, I have something for you.
Thank you.
Real quick.
Candy, you and I will work on hope.
But
Okay, good.
Left you-
That's something
left
I
you-
can optimistically look forward to.
There you go.
We've left you alone.
I wouldn't be too hopeful about it.
I was wondering, as we left early last week, I was wondering if how we left you in hope or in hopeless or.
I really.
Always
I think this is hilarious. It's wonderful.
We have a lot of fun. I think we arrived at no conclusion, but as individuals, we clarify who we are along the way, don't you think?
Yes, there are moments of extreme clarity every.
And also, well,